Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hi, this is Tracy Stuckrath with Thrive Meetings and Events and the podcast Eating at a Meeting. And today's guest I am so excited to have on is Mary Vargas. She is an attorney who does nationwide impact litigation on behalf of individuals with disabilities, including those with food allergies, celiac disease, and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. She is a founding partner at Vargas, LLP. Hello, Mary. How are you?
Hi, Tracy. I'm so happy to be here.
Likewise. So I have been following your work for I have no idea how long. And we have met now a couple of times in person, and we'll talk about me driving to Virginia because that was very eye-opening to me. But can you explain a little bit more? So you're a litigation attorney who I know in the past has worked with the visually impaired and hearing impaired, but now you're focusing a lot on food allergies and disabilities. So can you explain to the audience how disabilities and food allergies mesh or work or related?
So it's really all the same work. So we represent individuals with disabilities, and federal law dictates what the definition is of being a person with a disability. That's somebody who has a substantial impairment of a major life activity. So if you look at a person with a food allergy or someone with celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, if they have substantial impairment when they're exposed to their allergen or when they ingest gluten, then they are an individual with a disability, and they have a right to full and equal access in almost every realm of the world. In the United States, of all in employment, in access to public services, and access to government, importantly, in access to social services and dining. Everything that an individual with a disability does, they have a right to full and equal access.
So, and under the ADA, so the ADA is what, 30 years old this year?
Yeah.
And it was signed in by George Bush, the first. And I know there was changes to it in 2008, and I talk about this a lot in what I do in education, is that the ADA was amended in 2008 that specifically added eating and all of our bodily functions to the list of major life activities. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what was happening prior to the changes in the ADA, well, first of all, prior to the changes in the ADA, cases filed by people with medically necessary dietary restrictions, those cases were being thrown out of court. But it wasn't just an issue for our community. It was an issue for people with disabilities in general. People who were deaf were having their cases thrown out because courts were saying they weren't deaf enough. Or people with all kinds of disabilities, courts were saying, well, but they're not really disabled. And the courts were saying you had to consider disability in ways that really weren't consistent with what Congress intended when the law was originally passed. So the law was amended to make clear, to address some of these issues, and to say that when a case goes to court, when a person with a disability says that they've experienced discrimination, it shouldn't be that hard to figure out whether they have a disability or not. That's not where the focus should be. The focus should be on whether they had access. So it really shifted the conversation and the way these cases were treated in courts, where cases were now in the past. After passage of the ADA Amendments Act, that's not happened. Where somebody has a substantial impairment because of a food allergy. They go into anaphylaxis. If they consume dairy, that's pretty substantial. It impacts every part of their function. So they are an individual with a disability, and it moves the focus in the courts to what does equal access look like, and how do we make that happen? So it's really changed the focus in a way that has allowed us to, in terms of the litigation that we do, it's allowed us to build a foundation, and a strong foundation, that individuals with food allergies and celiac and non-celiac sensitivity, gluten sensitivity, that those folks have a right to be in the room, and that they have a right to an experience that's not unlike that of everybody else, and to really challenge us to be creative in thinking about how to make that happen.
It's a lot. And one of the things that I say in my sessions is that, in 2008, the ADA didn't go and put a billboard up and say, hey, these are now part of the things and you need to pay attention to it. So there's a lot of people in the food service industry that don't even know that food allergies are now covered under the ADA.
Right. And that's really consistent culturally with how people think about food allergy and celiac disease. We're always pushing against these cultural misperceptions that, just don't eat soy, or, you have an EpiPen, so it's all good, or, gluten is kind of a fad diet. There are all these cultural misperceptions that pervade the food industry as well as our culture more broadly that we're pushing up against, to really articulate. I mean, as a lawyer, for me, when I draft complaints, I'm not just saying somebody has a food allergy and they could go into anaphylaxis. I'm detailing in the complaint in an effort to educate the court, and often the other side as well, about what exactly it means to live with a food allergy or to live with celiac disease, because people are often operating from misperceptions that if they could just get it, they just understood what was at stake, I think a lot of people would choose to act differently.
So one of the things that I know about you is that you are also a food allergy mom.
Right. So
your lawyer and your mom, how does that play out in what you do?
Sometimes they're the same thing. When I get calls from parents who have kids with celiac disease who are saying, my kid's going on a field trip and I don't know what to do in order to make it safe for them. I get that on a mom level, and vice versa. The lawyer interferes in the momming as well. 2 years ago, we got the decision in JD versus Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I think we got that on a Friday morning at 9 o'clock or something like that, out of like a bolt of lightning out of nowhere, saying that, folks who serve food may need to make accommodations for individuals with celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. That was on a Friday morning. On Monday morning, my own son was going to Hershey Park on a class trip. And the night before, he was talking to me about, well, can I really bring in my lunch? And what if they stop me? And what do I say? And can I tell them you're my mom? And I was in this weird position of, we'd just gotten this case. And it wasn't a matter of how do I use it as a lawyer. It was, as a mom, what do I tell him to advocate for himself in a way that's effective and empowering, and it was a weird kind of position to be in.
That's so true. And okay, so one of the things that I'm in the meetings industry, and my podcast is called Eating at a Meeting, but I think it crosses the board to birthday parties and field trips to Williamsburg and Hershey Park and things like that. But there are a lot of adults with food allergies, and we don't want to be, and I think kids are the same way. We don't want to be a burden. We don't want to call it out. So how can we address that in the workplace? And I know you had the one case with Panera, which was a workplace experience, but how can we transition to, I don't want that. And if you want to talk about the Panera case a little bit, if you can, what can be done differently? What can we learn about it in the workplace?
So I think there are a couple of issues in the workplace. And one of the issues stems from what we were just talking about a few minutes ago about the change in the law. So we have whole generations of folks with food allergies and celiac disease who are not accustomed to thinking of themselves as individuals with disabilities or thinking that they have rights. So before we even get to how to employers or anyone else, how do folks who are not part of the community, how do they think about inclusivity? We also have to make sure that we're educating our own. There's a huge resistance sometimes to people with food allergies that I encounter. People who say, "Well, I don't want to say that I have a disability. It's not like I use a wheelchair. It's not like I use that." And a lot of that comes from, again, cultural misperceptions about what it means to have a disability. I've represented a deafblind triathlete. She could,
wow.
She could beat me any day of the week, and I would be completely honored to be anything at all like her. And so there needs to be a mindset change and some education done in our own community to recognize that having a disability is simply a legal definition. It's, do you have a substantial life impairment? A major life activity. And if you do, then you're entitled to legal protection. And it's not a moral judgment. It's not a question of, I think sometimes it almost comes down to like, do I deserve pity or something like that? It's not about that. It's about empowering people to ask to have a seat at the table and to be included. And so I think making those changes, some of it has to start with our own community. Then once somebody asks for access, then the challenge is to make sure that folks who have the ability to make that happen and the obligation to make that happen, they understand clearly what their legal obligations are. They're willing to recognize where they're not the expert in every disability that there might be and every food restriction that there might be. They're willing to be humble enough to ask a person what they need and trusting enough to recognize that most people don't go to employers and ask for something that's unnecessary or something that targets them or makes them different. People want to blend in for the most part. And so really everybody has to educate themselves, be educated on what it means to have a right to equal access, and then how to make that happen. A lot of that is around the dialogue between employers and employees, between folks who are attending conferences and those who are hosting them and venues. There's just a lot of conversation that has to be had, and some of this is going to take time. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was no case law saying that a person who was on a school field trip might need to be allowed to bring their own safe food. That case law, that's 2019. This just happened. Right. And it just happened in an appellate court, which is a big deal, but it just happened in one appellate court. So that change has to ripple throughout the United States, and that education will go with that ripple. And that's some of that change is going to have to come with time.
Yeah. And every little tiny step that we do helps with that ripple, but it also feels like this mountain that we have to, I'm like, I'm so far behind. Nobody understands this. And oh my God, I got so much work to do. I'm like, I'm going to have work until the day I'm dead, hopefully it's not, tomorrow, whatever, but it is still empowering in the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing to say, hey, okay, let's think about it differently,
It's really exciting, I think, to be at the beginning of something.
Yeah.
I think there are some areas of disability law where the work is really far along the way, and there's not as much cultural misperception. That's certainly not true everywhere. But in terms of establishing legal precedents, which from my bias are a really important monitor for where things stand in the United States, we're really at the beginning of that journey. We're just starting, the cases really weren't sustainable prior to the change in the law. And so those cases have just gotten to court in the last not even decade. And we're just getting to a point where we're getting decisions, not just in district courts, but in appellate courts, which take even longer. And those will change things as we go. But yeah, there's a long way to go still.
So one of the cases that you sent me to pay attention to was, is it Harris versus University of Maryland? Is that right? Smith versus Hannah is her first name. Yeah. Smith versus University of Maryland. And it brought back to me the Leslie University case.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are they not paying attention to that?
Right. So Leslie University was a Department of Justice settlement, and it was critically important. It was, a huge, big splash for you and I because there was nothing else. But it's not binding legal precedent. And so while it's really important and it's instructive and people ought to be listening, there aren't court decisions. There haven't been until recently court decisions that say they have to. That's now changed. There's been court decisions. There's been more education. The law has changed. So now I think there's a better understanding of what has to be done. And I see, a case like Smith versus University of Maryland, it's the perfect companion to a case like JD versus Colonial Williamsburg. Mm-hmm. What JD needed was the opportunity to bring his own safe food. He wasn't able to safely eat the food at a venue. He needed to bring his own in order to be included. Hannah Smith is the flip side of the same coin. She was a student going off to college for the first time at what is the flagship university in the state of Maryland. It's extraordinarily impressive. It's the school that all the kids want to go to. And to go there, you live in a dorm, you have to buy a meal plan, you don't have a car on campus. In order for her to be included, she needed to be able to eat safely in the dining hall, and not just to eat tuna fish at every meal, but over a period of months and years to be able to eat a balanced diet that was reliably safe for her. So JD's needs and Hannah's needs, in some ways they're opposite. In some ways they're exactly the same. And I think the lesson of both is you need to look at what the individual needs and listen to what they need, listen to what their doctors have said, and make sure that you know what you don't know and you can actually provide the safety that you promise. And if you can't do that, and I would argue that some entities have to do that, but if for some reason an entity doesn't have to do that, then they need to find other ways for the person to be included. And that doesn't mean sitting in the room and not eating while everybody else is eating. That's not what it's about. That can't be the answer. And what the courts have said is in other areas of disability law, in fact, in one of the cases we litigated on behalf of a deaf medical student, is that you have to look at how a program or activity, how it's used by people without disabilities, and then try and give the person with a disability a like experience, not a separate experience, and maybe not exactly the same experience, because obviously somebody with a peanut allergy is not going to eat a peanut butter sandwich if everybody else on the trip is doing that. But to look at the experience and in an inclusive mindset, figure out with consultation from the person who knows what they need best, how do you make their experience something that's safe and like the experience that other participants have? So
being a meeting planner, and I've worked events from 10 people to 7,000 people. I mean, one event we were serving 7,000 people. We had 683 people with dietary requests. And an event I just did in January, 600 people, 200 of them had dietary requests. Granted, 100 of them were vegan and vegetarian, which in a way is easy to do, but not necessarily, right? Right. And with all kinds of petri dish food made these days, you don't necessarily know what is what. But we had 100 people with different restrictions, and that's challenging for the back of the house. How do you figure that out? So do you have best practices or thought processes on for the food service industry on what to do on that large scale?
I know there are folks who are working on best practices, and that's not really my area of expertise. But what I would say is there has to be advanced thought and planning before the conference happens, before you're faced with the request for a specific dietary need, looking at the person from the moment they first interact. So it's when they first sign up for the conference, in your promotional materials, in your planning, all the way through the meal service. What's offered to everybody, and how can you streamline and simplify ways to be inclusive that make it safe and welcoming for your participants, but also lighten the burden. And that may be things like how the kitchen food prep space is set up. Is there a dedicated, separate, allergy-free area? Look at your processes for how foods are purchased in terms of what labeling's on the food. Look at processes for who handles when there's an on-site request for something that you weren't expecting. Who's the go-to person? Is that something that every server is delegated to handle? Or are there certain people who are dedicated to and responsible for that task? How are orders handled and documented? All of the any planning that can be done ahead of time is planning that makes it more likely that everyone will feel welcome, that everyone will be safe, and that your program will be inclusive.
So something you said in there. So people with food allergies know that they're going to go to a convention center or a hotel, and it is not a certified allergen-free environment.
Right.
But the venues are like, well, we can't provide for them. I mean, and the thought process and the conversations that I have with them is like, we know it's not certified allergen free, but under food safety regulations and guidelines, you have a duty of care that you've been trained, and so you may be able to do you agree that you could potentially reduce your mitigation or
100%.
Okay.
100%. I can say, as you know, I'm the bad guy who sues people. I can say that I'm not looking to sue people who had a bad day. I'm not looking to play a game of gotcha. I'm looking to identify where there are weaknesses in the system and where we really need to do better. Where you have a young child with a known peanut allergy who's served a grilled cheese sandwich with peanut butter hidden inside. Those are the situations I'm worried about. I'm worried someone's going to die, and I think a lot of the conversation has to be about not promises, not can you guarantee something, but about facts. I think somebody who's sitting at a table ready to eat needs to be able to ask the questions that are relevant to them, the factual questions. Where is your food prepared? In what order is it prepared? Do you have dedicated pans? Whatever questions are relevant to them, they need to be able to ask. The venue needs to be able to answer truthfully. And where there's something that's a risk, they can't say, they shouldn't say, I can't promise you that you're safe. They should say, this is what our practices are. If you don't feel comfortable that this is safe for you, what else can we do to make sure that you have a great experience? A lot of that is about, it's about how we communicate with customers.
And it's community. And you said it a little while ago, it's from the start when you design your registration system or invite somebody to a birthday party, what is that process all the way through and communicating? And, one of the things that you said to me earlier or pre video was, labeling, how do you communicate that labeling? And I find it very frustrating a lot of times when you go through and it'll say nut-free and dairy-free, but on the next one, it doesn't say contains dairy,
right?
Or contains nuts.
Right.
And that's miscommunication.
Yeah. So there's so many issues in food labeling that make what you do hard, makes it really hard for consumers. And there's a lot of important work that is being done and needs to be done to change our labeling laws so that everybody has the information they need. Some of what I think is critical in terms of what you do is that the people who are preparing the food and serving the food are appropriately trained to understand the limits on the current labeling laws. When a chef believes that any food they buy from X company would say if it contains gluten, that is a dangerous misperception that opens them to liability and makes them more likely to have a situation that's regrettable, that's potentially fatal, that's very damaging. So understanding the limitations of the law, understanding what the best practices are in terms of food preparation. There are programs out there that go into commercial kitchens and train folks how to do this, taking advantage of those programs. The existing training for chefs largely doesn't include much of anything to do with what we're talking about today. There's very little information, if any, about labeling. There's very little information about food allergies, and it may not even be accurate. And so recognizing that just because you have a terrific chef doesn't mean that they have the most up-to-date necessary information for them to understand what it is they're serving to somebody so that they're prepared to answer the question, so that they can think through what kind of menu to offer so that it's a little bit more flexible and easier to serve when you are facing a large group with multiple dietary restrictions that in some cases may be competing. You know, my son's vegetarian and he has celiac disease and he has nut allergies. So those things don't play well together. And
don't.
I get that that's a challenge. It's a challenge for me as a mom. It's a challenge for him. So I get that it's a challenge for folks who are doing this under enormous pressure at events. And I have to think that the answer to that is always going to be education.
Agreed. And, and that's the challenge. Vegans rely on nuts, and gluten-free people, the products that are made are usually nut-based breads and things like that. So that you do have a challenge at home, so I think chefs in hotels and convention centers or wherever need to understand that it's a challenge for them at home too.
Yeah.
And you don't always want to eat sauteed peppers and, boiled chicken for lunch. Yeah.
Well, and there's, I can't give hard numbers on this, but as an allergy mom, as a mom of a kid with celiac disease, I can tell you that there is no more grateful customer than the customer who's had their child have a seat at the table and been included. It is not unusual for parents of kids with food allergies to walk into a bakery that has something safe for their kid to eat and to cry. It's contrary to public perception. It's not most parents, most customers with food allergies and dietary restrictions. They're not demanding change. They're not the angry mob. They are so profoundly grateful when it's done well, when they're given the right information, when they're reassured with true facts about what they can safely eat and not eat, when they're talked to like they matter. And those are the customers that will come back over and over and over again. And as the numbers of people who are diagnosed with celiac disease increases, as the number of folks with food allergies, particularly kids, are aging into the workplace with food allergies, as event planners, as companies are able to seamlessly provide inclusive experiences for that new reality, for that new customer base, they are going to earn a very loyal following. And for the folks who don't want to talk about it, who won't do it, and who are rigid in how people experience what they offer, those folks are not gonna survive in what is brave new world in terms of food allergies, like it or not. And I certainly don't like it. But these are challenges that are real, and we have to figure out how to handle them with more grace than we have, and with more inclusivity than we have in the past.
Yeah, it is. It's changing the way that we think about food and how we make that food and the steps that we're doing to process them. One of the lines, or a couple, it was in the Smith versus University of Maryland, is the student who like, oh, you called me out yesterday for giving you something that made you sick. Here's your I'm like, I wouldn't have eaten the burnt toast either.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen a picture. I don't know if you've seen a picture of that meal.
No.
We are talking about charred to unrecognizable food.
Wow.
That was packed and served to her and delivered with that message. And not only is it unappetizing, that wasn't even the point. The point was when somebody says to you, enjoy your gluten-free food, and they're upset with you for having asked to not be rushed to the hospital, to ask to be able to eat safely in the place where you live. You then can't trust going forward what's in your food at all. It's not just then that you worry about mistakes. It's then you're worrying about somebody who's angry and who's sending you a very deliberate message that you should not rely on the food, that you can't.
Right.
That's a serious.
It is. And so that brings me to food bullying. And, that instance was totally, in my eyes, food bullying. And then that takes me to the Panera case of the food bullying by the boss and the coworkers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can't.
Well, food bullying. Let's talk about food bullying.
I can talk about food bullying, though, generally. And this is something, unfortunately, that seems to be on the rise. I think as kids with food allergies in very large numbers are hitting the workforce, we're just seeing, I think, that real first push of the large number of kids who grew up with food allergies who are aging into employment. Those folks are starting to experience bullying in the workplace, which is terrifying on a lot of levels. It makes them incredibly unsafe. And I'm getting more calls about that. And it's a really challenging issue to address, because if somebody's not safe in their workplace, they can't stay there to figure it out. You can't stay at a workplace where somebody's deliberately exposing you to your allergens. And there have been a number of these cases now. There was a case, it wasn't mine, but there was a case in the Southwest where a worker at a healthcare company with a peanut allergy would come into work and find that somebody had crumbled peanut shells all over their desk and all over their phone. And that person had an anaphylactic reaction in a meeting, and their boss didn't call 911. I mean, these are life-threatening issues that you can't function in a workplace like that. And so there's a lot more of that happening, unfortunately. It's flat out unlawful. And I think we're going to see more of those cases going forward, unfortunately, being litigated.
There's a meeting planner out of Boston who has a severe shellfish allergy. I mean, she can't go into the grocery store when they're steaming shrimp, and she lives in Boston, unfortunately. Right. But same thing in her workplace. I mean, she ended up going to the Disabilities Association or organization of the state, but the company just dismissed everything that they were, they put up a sign for maybe 2 weeks and just didn't communicate it because they're like, what's the big deal? Right. It is a big deal.
And that when employers have an attitude of it's not a big deal, that unfortunately is communicated very clearly to the workforce, who then can respond in ways that are really dangerous and certainly unwelcoming. And it's not just that employers have to make sure that somebody is not discriminated on the basis of disability in terms of what the employer does, but at some point the employer also has to bear responsibility for the environment that they've created, where, I'm hearing stories about other employees doing things to folks with food allergies and celiac disease and making a mockery of it in a way that's hurtful, in a way that's discriminatory, in a way that's dangerous. And at some point, employers are responsible for that. You can't just ignore the fact that folks in your company are mocking somebody with food allergies. Employers have to actually affirmatively act, not only to protect that person medically, but to make sure that they're not targeted in other ways that makes them unequal in the workplace.
So we're getting close to our time, and this doesn't have to do with the ADA, but it has to do with religious-based practices related to food and beverage. So if you're kosher or halal and, somebody's ordering food for you, that could actually be seen as discrimination, not under the ADA, but can be seen as discrimination against somebody's religious-based beliefs. Am I accurate in that?
Yeah, you're correct in that. It's not an area of law I specialize in, but I don't think it's altogether different, really, in experience, short of the fact that somebody who ingests something with their allergen, for example, and has an anaphylactic reaction, they could be in critical risk. So it's a little bit different in that sense, but it's really the same idea that we can do hard things, and some of these things are easy, and some of these things we're talking about are a little harder. And what makes them manageable is, I think, acknowledging them, getting the expertise. There's a lot of expertise out there in terms of how to make kitchens safe, in terms of how to do meal planning, in terms of labeling. Getting that expertise so that as an employer or as an event planner, you're not making decisions on something that you just really don't have the expertise to be managing.
One of the questions that I asked you pre-recording was, what do you want people to know about what you do? And I changed it on my thing. It says, what is the intent behind what you do? But so either way you can... Yeah.
Well, let me say it in the context, for example, of an actual case.
Okay.
So we have this case, Smith versus University of Maryland. I live in Maryland. I have 3 boys. My youngest, as I've said, has food allergies and celiac disease. He's 12. So I figure I have about 6 years before my son is in a position where he may want to go to the flagship university in the state of Maryland and be able to have an experience that's independent and safe and everything that college is supposed to be for students without disabilities. My intention in looking at something like this, it's never, it's to make the world better. It's to make the world more open, more safe, more accessible. And, in a case like Smith, I'm hoping that my son is able to apply to go to the University of Maryland in 6 years, and that I don't have to say, educationally it's a fabulous school, but you can't go there because of your disability. I don't want to say that. Right. So that's really what we do. We're trying to make sure that the world is more open and more accessible while also being safe.
And just quickly, I want to say how that totally relates to your JD versus Williamsburg Foundation too, because what you said to me, one of those things is JD's, and with his experience of not being able to eat the food there, he looked at his dad and he's like, I just don't want anyone else to have this experience. I'm going to cry. He's
an amazing kid. He has a little sister who has celiac disease, and she was at the time going to the same school. And his concern was that fairly imminently, she was going to be going on the yearly trip to Colonial Williamsburg. And he was feeling, like I said, he's a super kid. He was feeling not only an obligation to the sort of the unknown kids who came after him, but he was feeling an obligation to the very known little sister who he didn't want to experience what he experienced. And that was everything about why he stood up for himself. And I've said this other times, it's often really, really hard to be the kid who stands up and says, I deserve something better. Sometimes you get friendly fire from your own community saying, nobody's going to want to serve us if you file a lawsuit, or, you should just go home and live in a bubble, or, why didn't your mother do this? Or there's all these things that people say. And really these folks who are willing to assert their rights for full and equal access, they are complete heroes in my book, and they're doing it I can say in 100% of my client base, they're doing it for really altruistic reasons. And it is about making the world better. So hopefully we continue to move the ball along and get to a place where a year or 2 years from now, we're looking at really refining something that refining how to do this well. Right now, I think, unfortunately, some folks are still in the early learning stages of recognizing what the obligation is and how they need to meet that obligation.
Totally agree. Okay, I am totally asking you this question because it made me laugh out loud. What is your favorite food?
No. Oh my gosh, you're outing me.
I am. You said everybody knows it.
Okay. So I have this thing about birthday cake. So I love to bake because I'm a food allergy celiac mom. I bake for my son all the time. But the inside truth is that I actually don't like homemade cakes. I like to make them. I don't like to eat them. What I really like is store-bought cakes. And in particular, I love the great big 55 serving Costco birthday cakes, the chocolate ones. And I have mastered how you take those 55 servings and you cut them and grease them.
Oh my goodness.
An obsession. To an unhealthy degree. It's something when I get birthday presents, they often say something about cake or Costco cake. It's not something that my son can eat, but it's totally something that I love, and it's very definitely my favorite food. And thank you for making sure that everybody else who didn't already know that. No.
You're welcome. I mean, but I think that's shows too that you do the stuff for your kid, but you still have to love what you love to eat too at some point, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, by definition, my diet has become not 100% gluten-free, but, just like I said before, you go to venues that treat your family, your friends, your colleagues well. And right. So just sort of by definition, my diet has become closer to gluten-free. It's certainly pretty much nut-free, except when I travel. But Costco cake, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. Mary Vargas with Stein Vargas LLP. Thank you so much for being on Eating at a Meeting podcast today.
Well, and thank you for what you do. I really believe it's the critical frontier for folks who are, when we look at doctors going to conferences, critical things happen there in terms of their professional development. When we look at employees there's so much that is important that happens in those spaces. And what you do is really at the frontier of making sure those places are ready, not only to handle customers with food allergies and celiac disease, but to really excel at it in a way that expands their customer base and brings people back and really makes those issues sort of disappear. So they're not the focus, and the focus can really be on the learning and the social experience that's critical to those kinds of events.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.